So giving it to the New York Times before it's filed in court is something a victim would do. Before the New York Times article was ever published, Baldoni's own team leaked the complaint to the press and gave us all the evidence to prove it. Lively's legal team noted that they filed the complaint on Friday, December the 20th, and at the same time sent a copy of the CRD complaint to Baldoni's legal team. In Baldoni's initial complaint against the New York Times, page 2 states that at 9:46 p.m. Eastern Time on Friday, December the 20th, New York Times reporter Megan Twohey requested plaintiff's response to an imminent 4,000-word bombshell story concerning their alleged orchestration of a smear campaign against Blake Lively. Wayfarer were asked if they wanted to provide a response and to do so before noon Eastern Time the next day, December the 21st, complaining that this was a mere 14 hours overnight. Yet just hours later, TMZ begins working on an article titled "Blake Lively Sues Justin Baldoni for Sexual Harassment Smear Campaign." This was at 2:10 a.m. Eastern Time. Baldoni's attorney Brian Friedman is also up at this hour, and just 6 minutes later, at 2:16 a.m., sends his response to the New York Times request for comment. At 2:16 a.m. Eastern Time, plaintiffs' legal representatives responded. December the 21st at 7:54 a.m. Eastern Time, TMZ published their article and are the first to break the story, which includes Brian Friedman's private correspondence to the New York Times, calling the allegations fake, outrageous, intentionally salacious, and with an intent to publicly hurt. Since the New York Times had yet to publish this, it shows that Baldoni's own team leaked both the complaint and Friedman's response to TMZ. Interestingly, though, it's positioned as a statement from Brian Friedman, not as his response to the New York Times request for comment. In fact, the New York Times isn't mentioned at all. 8:47 a.m. Eastern Time, People published their article citing TMZ and not the New York Times as their source. 9:11 a.m. Eastern Time, The Mirror published their article citing TMZ and not the New York Times as their source. 9:21 a.m. Eastern Time, Hello Magazine published their article citing TMZ, not the New York Times as their source. 9:41 a.m. Eastern Time, The Express US published their article citing TMZ, not the New York Times as their source. 9:48 a.m. Eastern Time, Suggest published their article citing TMZ as the source. The Daily Voice published their article also at 9:50 a.m. Hollywood Gossip published their article. 10:08 a.m. Eastern Time, Goss published their article. 10:09 a.m. Eastern Time, Pop Culture published their article. All of which were all published before the New York Times published their article and cite TMZ, not the New York Times, as their source. 10:11 a.m. Eastern Time, the New York Times publishes their article, as listed by both Baldoni's complaint and the metadata on the New York Times article itself. The Sun US published their article citing TMZ, not the New York Times, as their source. 10:25 a.m. Eastern Time, Her publishes their article citing TMZ, not the New York Times, as their source. 10:31 a.m. Eastern Time, Parade published their article citing TMZ, not the New York Times, as their source. 10:35 a.m. Stylecaster publishes their article. 10:37 a.m. Eastern Time, The Mirror US publishes their article. 10:42 a.m. Eastern Time, Cosmopolitan publishes their article. 10:53 a.m. Eastern Time, Slash Film publishes their article. 10:53 a.m. Eastern Time is also when TV Insider publishes their article. 11:50 a.m. Eastern Time, Distractify published their article. 11:58 a.m. Eastern Time, The New York Post publishes their article. 1:25 p.m. Eastern Time, NME publishes their article. And at 3:28 p.m., 2Fab published their article. And all of these cite TMZ, not the New York Times, as their source. It is wild to talk about the damage done by the New York Times article when Baldoni's own team deliberately worked overnight to ensure there would be dozens of articles written based on his own leak. And again, this is textbook abusive behavior. Look at what you made me do. I was forced to harm you in this way, blaming the victim for the perpetrator's actions. A reminder that Lively went through the process of privately handling these HR complaints. Wayfarer fully admits they did hire a PR crisis firm in retaliation, and it also admits they did strategize how to attack her credibility if those allegations were ever made public. All the New York Times did was expose Wayfarer's behavior publicly. How dare they? It is perfectly normal and expected for victims to speak up and speak out before their day in court. Just weeks after the New York Times investigation into Baldoni, Vulture dropped their investigation into Neil Gaiman. And no one has suggested that his victims had no right to speak out and detail their allegations publicly. Baldoni is giving us a masterclass in abusive manipulation. When his team learned that one of his victims was going to speak out, they worked through the night to ensure that her voice was drowned out, to dominate the headlines, to make sure there were dozens of articles written discrediting her claims before her voice ever had a chance to be heard. In short, a man accused not just of sexual misconduct, but also of carefully orchestrating leaks to the press in order to damage his victim's reputation in retaliation, responded to the news she was going to make those allegations public by carefully orchestrating a leak to the press in order to damage his victim's reputation in retaliation. Not just then, but virtually every day since, for well over a month. And yet, despite concrete evidence of his continued abusive behavior, we're once again expressing doubt over Blake Lively because she has the audacity to not be the right kind of victim. She's too mean, she isn't disgusted enough, she didn't speak out the right way, why did she go public? Why is she inconveniencing him this way? She's crazy, unhinged, incompetent, deceptive. The same playbook that's used every time a woman speaks up. Baldoni's own PR team acknowledged there are at least 2 other HR complaints against Wayfarer. And seeing how Lively has been treated, the PR campaign that has been waged against her and anyone who supports her, like Colleen Hoover, who had to delete her Instagram account, how do you think those other victims feel about coming forward? Do you think they feel empowered to tell their story, to identify themselves, stand up and speak out? Or do you think they feel scared and threatened into staying silent? Because that is exactly what an abuser would do. They will use their last breath to continue to abuse their victim.